evening to everyone. My name is Jenny Hodgson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And you've all joined to hear from Themrise, who we'll be passing over to shortly. Themrise will say a little bit about the origins of the work that she's sharing today, but I think this is a process, one of a number of processes and conversations that have we have been having within the context of philanthropy and development aid for a number of years now, about the radical reimagining of the entire system for philanthropy, humanitarian and development aid. And clearly this has all been brought into sharp relief in the last couple of weeks, particularly with the freeze on USAID funding. And I'm sure that will come up in the conversation. But I think it's important to say that this work began much further ago than today, right, Themrise? And this particular piece of work that Themrise is sharing today was actually the second stage in a process of exploration, brainstorming, consultation that Themrise has been and wishes to continue to be leading. And it was specifically as part of the lead up to the Shift the Power Summit, which was held in Bogota in December 2023. And a large element of the summit in Bogota was around the radical reimagining, around rethinking everything, basically. And so one of the main conversations amongst many, we looked at local resources, we looked at measurement, we looked at regenerative activism, and there was a component specifically around reimagining the entire system.
Se me ha conectado.
So we'll be muting people respectfully while others are speaking. And so this piece of work was part of that process as a lead up to the summit, but also to involve people in conversations around reimagining systems who perhaps aren't normally invited into them. So I just wanted to set that context for the meeting, recognizing that for many people working in this system, this is a very challenging and disruptive time. But for the world, I think if we look at the larger context, it really does require, while dealing with the present, kind of reimagining the futures that we want. I would say, I mean, it's great to see so many people in this conversation. We're a small organization, the Global Fund, and we're delighted if we get 70 people to a webinar. And I think there were almost 400 people registered for this one. So I think it is a sign of the hunger for new ideas in these difficult times and for being in solidarity with each other as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Themrise. She's going to talk through, she's going to have a PowerPoint, she's going to talk through the research that she's presenting, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. So Themrise, let me hand over to you, and you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Welcome, everybody. Wonderful to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm speaking to you today from a very, very cold and snowy Ottawa in Canada, where we've had massive snowstorms and a plane crash, unfortunately, dominate the headline news. But thank you. Thank you again for coming, and I really appreciate the support. As Jenny said, this is something that has been in the works for over a year now. And I guess it's timely in a way that it did come out when it did. And I think there's a lot in this. I have a presentation. I try to avoid doing PowerPoints, but there's just so much to say in terms of the findings of this report that, you know, it wouldn't be easy just to talk about it, wouldn't be able to do justice to it. So again, thank you very, very much, everybody, for coming. I just want to give a quick shout out to Jenny and Wendy, and thank you very much for organizing this. And thank you very much for having faith in me and trusting me with this piece of work. I really, really do appreciate that. So thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. And this is a longish presentation, but I will try and run through it as fast as I can. So I'll just start with the background to this, which goes actually began in September 2023. Actually, even before that, 6 months before that, in early 2023, I came up with this squiggle of a diagram. which I sort of came up with entirely on my own, sitting one day, just mulling over the thoughts and stuff. And I just came up with this diagram. And this diagram was basically a vision that I saw in terms of how we can actually look at global development and humanitarianism. Um, a lot of this emerged from the notions of decolonization, localization, shift the power, etc., which were very prominent in conversations that were happening in the aid sector around that time. And I myself was part of a lot of those conversations. But it seemed that we were really only talking and not really envisioning much on paper. So this was an attempt for me to make sense of all the different voices that I was hearing as part of the conversation, and to actually construct something in terms of when we're talking about change in the system, what would it actually physically and tangibly look like? So I came up with this very complex diagram, which isn't that complex when you boil down to it. And the Center for Humanitarian Leadership, based at Deakin University in Australia, gave me the opportunity to build on this diagram, to develop a narrative around it. So in 2023, with their support, I was actually able to develop a narrative and publish a concept paper, which looked at these various components and how we could actually envision a system, tangible system. And what this system looked at was the need to equalize the balance and decenter all the players. So we had a lot of players on both sides, but it was an unequal balance. The Global South wasn't being centered. There are a lot of the voices, majority of them were coming from the Global North. So this was an opportunity to actually recenter the Global South and decenter everybody else. Also, a lot of the conversations were talking about the impact of Western colonialism on aid and power relations. And while that is absolutely true and stands, I thought there was a need to move beyond that and to stop looking at the Global South as, an area that needed to be safe, conversations that we're actually still having to this day. So I developed this concept paper in 2023 and it was published, and it had three main goals. And the first of those was basically to view all the participants in the sector, both global development and humanitarianism, as being one. We had too many divisions, which were talking about organizations in one part of the world in one way, organizations in another part in a different way. And I envisioned all of them working together and being seen as one, as opposed to geographically opposed. That for me meant removing the word international from the vocabulary, because we talk about international organizations, but we're really only talking about global north organizations, and we're ignoring the fact that everybody really could be international. So that was the second goal of this ecosystem. And that led to the fact that we need to remove this distinction between North and South, which was really, I think, dividing the conversation instead of bringing it together. And we needed to move to a more regional perspective. The starting point for me was not the INGO, the international organization, or the donor organization, or the institutions that provide the funding. For me, the starting point was the country. And that is any and every country that we're talking about. Because the conversation was all about how can INGOs help? How can donor institutions help? No, for me, the focus was the country. So it was moving from national upwards to global, not the other way around. So it was a more bottom up, as they say in the parlance, and not a top down approach. And I came up with this diagram that looked at countries at the core, moving up into sub-regions and then regional and then a global effect. So for me, everything had to move from the country outwards rather than inwards, which is where the conversation was coming from. And I did that by developing 4 concepts in that paper. One was I suggested the term state and civil society entities, or SCSCs, to refer to all the various stakeholders that work in development. Because really we're looking at state and civil society working together in the conversation, but we're really not sure who the state is and who civil society is. But for me, that was a more inclusive way of looking at organizations rather than, INGOs or locally led organizations or Western donors or et cetera, et cetera. The second was, like I said, looking at the countries at the core of change and entities within each country as the driver of that change. So every country has its own set of SCSCs, and those SCSCs are the ones that drive the change internally, which is eventually what leads to the country's growth nationally. And then from there, move into looking at funding and cooperation regionally to begin with, at least, rather than altogether suddenly internationally. And lastly, looking at a complete shift in diversification of funding beyond ODA, which may or may not be one form of funding, but it cannot be the only form of funding. That's when this paper came out. That's when, I'm sorry, yeah, the intended outcomes of this were, for me, they they didn't have to be direct control of North over South. Instead of focusing on leading projects, which is how the sector is really designed and managed, we need to focus more on a knowledge exchange, and we can define knowledge much more broadly as well. Again, remove this distinction between international organization, now what we see as localization or locally led initiatives or organizations, and priorities had to be designed not by the donors, but by the countries themselves, and looking at a more diversified pool of funding. This concept paper ended with me suggesting a series of feedback loops or consultations, because the paper was written actually without any consultation. I completely did this off the top of my head. This was basically making sense of all the voices and thoughts and discussions that had been happening over the last couple of years. But what needed to happen now is I needed to know whether or not any of the concepts would actually make sense in the real world. And so I suggested a series of feedback loops that range from speaking to governments in the global south, to civil society organizations in the same area, to multilateral, bilateral, civil society organizations, the whole gamut of the SCSEs, if I'm using my own terminology here. And this is where Jenny and the Global Fund stepped in. As soon as the paper came out, I was just really fortunate enough that Jenny picked this up and offered to support me in conducting the first series of consultations, which was with number 2, civil society organizations in the Global South. And this was with the help of the GFCF network. This was the first of the consultations, so in a way it was a test run too. What we did was, with the help of GFCF's network of partner philanthropic community organizations in the South and some of my own people in my own network, I was able to speak to about 18 representatives, all belonging to South Asia, Latin America, Africa, and East Asia. There were 2 focus group discussions with Shift the Power Fellows. So GFCF has this program every year. It comes up with a cohort of representatives of its partner organizations who do a 1-year fellowship called the Shift the Power Fellows. So I was fortunate enough to meet with the 2 groups of the current and previous cohort of Shift the Power Fellows. Everybody was provided the concept paper in advance so that they could read it. And then I questioned them on the validity and the utility of the 4 different concepts that I had provided, and basically just got their feedback and opinions on it. So today I'd like to present the outcome of that consultation. So I'll start with the first one. The first one was looking at organizations as holistic and inclusive state and civil society entities. So the idea was to broaden and be more inclusive of what we define as an organization. So a number of the people I spoke to, some of whom are here today as well, most of them agreed that the terminology was more relevant to how we define collectives in the Global South, which is where majority of these entities reside. And it did have the potential to reduce the power imbalances implicit in the current terminology. So we're not talking about North and South. We're not talking about international and local. We're talking about everybody sort of on a similar level playing field. A very interesting aspect came up. Respondents said that it's not just organizations or entities that need to be included. It could also be individuals who are sometimes ignored in conversations, because not everybody is part of an entity. A number of people are activists in their own right. And so their voice could also be included in the definition of these entities. There's also a discussion about formality and informality. I had spoken in my concept paper that a number of informal collectives are normally ignored in the conversations. And we're seeing more and more of those collectives come up as activist organizations or activist groups, or just people in resistance movements. And they're never part of the conversations, although they're the ones who probably are able to shift balance much more holistically because they're coming from the very bottom. And so the idea of entities needs to be inclusive of them. And so these social movements, as I call them, as entities, respondents said they need to be seen as civil society actors in their own rights. They're not just, a blip that happened there when somebody was sort of organizing a protest against something. These are consistent community voices that are coming out about issues that affect them directly, as opposed to others representing them. There were some questions about this particular terminology. One of them was again related to social movements in the global south, many of whom are actually coming up because they're questioning the idea of nationhood. They're questioning the idea of what their actual governments stand for. So would these sort of resistance movements or social movements fit into the definition of us of an entity, of an SESE? I personally think they would and they should. That's the whole idea. But this was a question that was raised during the conversations, which led to a further and stronger definition and clarity of the term that was required. For instance, one respondent asked, could large multilateral organizations like the World Bank or the IFRC be included in this? Could the private sector be included in this? And I think those are very important and key things for us to discuss in terms of the hierarchy of entities that we are seeing and where do they belong. There was a concern, some of these entities, how are they going to manage? And that questioned the idea of formality versus informality. A lot of entities like this operate as informal groups. And they don't necessarily have to be formalized, because that brings in a lot more implications about, how they could be managed and maybe take them away from their actual message. So this was a concern that was raised. I mean, there was the idea of, will these informal community advocacy social movements be co-opted into the formal space? And if so, will this actually take them further away from their message? That was an important consideration. And lastly, we all know there's a great number of amount of distrust between governments and civil society in many countries of the world. And so will this challenge the inclusivity that the term envisions? So that was on the first concept. The second concept was countries as the core of change, where we viewed nations as the actual driver, the actual country and its own systems as the driver of change. So this got varying responses. The top one was basically every country is different. They have their own context, political, social, economic. They're at a different stage in their lifespan compared to others. So the context will vary in every country, which is absolutely correct. The other thing was, again, the distrust, so many countries, we talk of corruption. There's a lot of talk of corruption these days, about mismanagement of systems, about a lack of a complete apathy by the governments of many countries towards their own people. So how would this actually drive change? Because if it had to drive change earlier, it would have done that. One of the reasons countries are not able to drive their own change is because of these internal issues that they suffer from. Another idea that came up was, again, community process are the real drivers. It's not the government, it's not the country, it's the communities in those countries that drive the process of change. And that was an idea that came up during the discussions. One very interesting point that came up was that many countries in the global south have actually tried to challenge the system of global north dominance in the past, but they failed miserably because the pushback from powerful actors, both within their own countries, as well as the global north in particular, haven't allowed them to do this. So it's not that this idea of countries as the core of change is something that's, it's just come out of nowhere. Countries have tried to push back in the past, but they've always been pushed further behind just because of the inequalities in the power system. Some respondents spoke about the principle of universality, that all countries in the world need to adhere by certain values that are universal. So we've got human rights, access to services, access to free speech, freedom of expression, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't vary from country to country. So if we need to be successful as looking at countries at the core of change, countries have to also adhere to these universal principles. Another important, interesting point that came up was countries are great. You can start change internally within each countries, but to keep the momentum of that change going, do we still stick to the country, or then do we start moving beyond the country level? And is the leadership of that particular country conscious of what needs to be done? And again, contexts vary dramatically, so it's very hard to generalize this concept. And I completely agree with that point, but as I go further, the idea of country context, I think, is what makes this exactly a core reason to work more deeply with. The third concept was regional cooperation. Now, this concept got the least amount, I think, of responses because it's a very complex area. And the idea of using regional partnerships to build cooperation between countries of a particular region is something that I think many of us have seen, not particularly successfully around the world. I belong to South Asia, which we failed miserably in our own cooperation within our region. We haven't been able to get that down yet. So this was people were very skeptical about this idea. I still think it has some merit, but I completely understand the fact that, ECOWAS came up as a positive example within Africa as a regional collaboration that, or the African Union that has been able to highlight the voice of the regions within the continent as opposed to others doing it for them. But the other side of that was that such regional blocs are perhaps more high policy level government state related entities as opposed to speaking for the voice of the people or civil society. One very, very important point came up, which I also completely agree with, is that there are many regional blocs, such as, in the Middle East, and you've got the Gulf states, for instance, which are failing to do their part in the region. In fact, they're adding to more economic and political woes around the world than they are. So the idea of regional solidarity doesn't always match up, because you've got a lot of regions where you've got very wealthy countries who are out there, for their own purposes. And you've got other regions that are not well off at all and don't have that strength. So there is that absence of regional solidarity that we're seeing. And another very important point came up in the Southeast Asia context is that, you've got sub-regions within regions. So you can talk about, Southeast Asia. You can talk about the power of ASEAN, for instance, but the Pacific Island states are never included in these conversations, and they're part of the wider Asia-Pacific region. Or the Indo-Pacific region, as that's a new regional bloc that's being looked at by the Global North as well. So there is also a lot of exclusion happening within the regional blocks as well. And the final concept was of diversification of funding sources. Of course, this got the most traction amongst respondents because, again, we're talking about money here. And some very interesting ideas came up here in the sense that the flow of money between countries always looks at the large chunks of money that are coming in. So for instance, ODA, the large money coming in from the north to the south, but it doesn't actually account for what somebody called the small monies, which is you're talking about local resources. You're talking about in-country resources. So you're talking about national development funding coming from the public sector and governments. You're talking about diaspora contributions, which have enormous potential and are being seen as a additional resource or a new form of resource to countries, but we've still got to delve deeper into that. We've got community and local assets. You've got philanthropy. I'm from a country, Pakistan, which has the largest share of philanthropic funding and charitable funding coming in because of religious obligations, but nevertheless, our diaspora invests heavily in Pakistan in many social sectors and many, many nationwide programs in education, health, and humanitarianism are only surviving because of these contributions coming in from our diaspora and from the philanthropic community and charitable community within the country. But these are never really considered as national financial resources. It's always where's the money coming from outside, from a Western donor. So these were very important issues, and as somebody else as well pointed out, is that I mean, we have to include in national accounting systems the idea that these are part of our national exchequer. We all have ministries in our government that keep track on ODA money coming into the country, but we don't actually keep track of how much money we're generating ourselves. And that's important. Social enterprises, creation of local assets, etc. I mean, there were many examples that came up in the conversations whereby countries could actually generate revenue from themselves. And this is aside from generating national and public revenue like taxation, trade, etc., which do come up in conversations, but then you've got the other side where the people are actually contributing financially to development. Also, money is just one type of resource. We don't talk about human capital. We don't talk about the skills that we transfer from one region to another or one country to another. That is also a resource. So these were very important points that came up when we're talking about these four sectors. There were some common themes that emerged out of these conversations. I'm only going to list them now and not talk too much about them. But contextualization. So context is extremely important. And like many respondents said, every country context is different. And this has a very strong implication on my idea of countries as the core of change, because every country has a different context. And so if we don't understand and realize that particular context, we're not really associating very much with what's happening in the country. We're associating at a much higher level when we actually need to come down and associate on a much lower micro level. So contextualization is very, very important. And that's also has an implication on whether some countries are in a state where they do actually need a lot of external support, but a lot of countries can move out of that very easily. So you can't actually just blanket and say that, we need we do or we don't need aid. I mean, I'm very, very in the camp where we don't need aid, but I do understand the nuances, and it's not exactly black and white. Geopolitics is something that I think we're all sort of exposed to at the moment, and geopolitics never really comes up in the discussion of global development and humanitarianism. And that is key for us. We cannot ignore geopolitics, although a lot of people did say that we shouldn't bring geopolitics in, but I don't see how that's possible because aid really is geopolitical in many ways. Shrinking civic space. So this is a big issue that came up. Examples were given of Bangladesh and Malawi, where there is a heightened reduction in civic space. The government is reducing civic space. I'm from Pakistan. Pakistan is also undergoing a serious shrinking of civic space, which is it's a frightening time to be part of the civil society there, because this is not because there's not enough money. This is because there's too much money coming into the country from external sources. And, that's creating some very, very uncomfortable geopolitical truths. But shrinking civic space is not only because governments are corrupt in the global south. Shrinking civic space is also happening because there are a lot of foreign entities, using my own term. I don't want to use the term INGOs, but there you go, who are coming and taking up space from entities within those countries by coming and setting up and by being able to access a much larger pool of resources just because they happen to have more larger structures that can manage the capacity and the load and the scope. And so it is actually a lot of the international cooperation agencies that are also taking away civic space from local organizations. So it's not just corrupt governments. This is the other side of the story. And then so that's why we come to the role of what INGOs play. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about that. NGOs are desperately trying to stay relevant in this world. But from the conversations that are coming up, if we really want the country to be core of change, and if we really want change to happen locally, then the role of NGOs in a way becomes it becomes suspect. Also because INGOs are not only Western related, and this is a contradiction in terms because you've got a lot of organizations in Bangladesh, for instance, you've got BRAC, which is now seen as an INGO because it has a presence in countries outside Bangladesh. But it's not seen as a traditional INGO because it's based in Bangladesh and not somewhere in the UK or the US. And so this, I think this needs to be really the idea of for me is very important because then again, you're discluding organizations just because of their geographical location and including others. I've always been a believer that humanitarian and development aid need to be separated. They're obviously part of the same ecosystem, absolutely, but as their objectives and their modalities are different, they're there for different purposes. So I've always believed in keeping the two separate and looking at the two of them separately. But it was really interesting that the respondent said that you actually can't separate the two. Because they go hand in hand. Development aid can assist a country to be stronger so that when a humanitarian disaster strikes or catastrophe strikes, they are able to cope with that humanitarian disaster. At the same time, humanitarian aid can only be strong if you've got a strong base, a foundation that's been built with the help of development aid. So this was, again, another humanitarian versus development aid concept that kept coming up again and again in the conversations. And finally, movement building. So I cannot stress enough how important social movements are and could be in this scenario. And the fear is that they will be co-opted by governors, by foreign governments or by donors, because they're playing a very important role. And they're becoming much more prominent. And everything that becomes prominent is something that the international aid system wants to pounce on. So there is this fear that movement building really needs to stay local and it needs to stay in the voices of the people. It can't be NGOized, right? So these were some of the common threads that came up. There are a few issues that came up that I think a lot needs further exploration, but four stood out in particular. One was that there needs to be more clarity in terms of how we speak about funding and funders. So we've got community philanthropy. We've got participatory grant making. We've got grants versus loans. We've got charity. We've got aid. So we need to actually separate all these terms and see what the implications of each are, what the modalities of each are. Secondly, as I mentioned before, it was expanding the idea of resources beyond money. Resources aren't just money. They're more than that. They're people. They're human beings. So we need to bring that into the conversation. Lack of country leadership, both in the North and the South. I think this is really important because we're always talking about the global South like it's a monolith and like as if there is absolutely nothing wrong with institutions of the global North, like they're perfectly fully capable of everything. No, there is a lack of leadership in institutions all over the world. There is a lack of trust between governments and civil societies internally, as well as externally. A lot of civil society organizations, entities in the global South are beginning not to trust leadership of global North institutions, so it goes both ways. And finally, the importance of local grassroots resistance movements and the idea of resistance. There's a lot of talk about what resistance entails. There's violent resistance, there's nonviolent resistance, but all of these come because of an issue that is so ingrained within our own communities, right at the very bottom, that this is what we talk about when we talk about grassroots. It's not just a resistance to aid, it's a resistance to malpractice, it's a resistance to lack of human rights. I see a lot of these resistance movements actually coming up in my country, Pakistan. I can only speak about my country, but others have also given examples of how literally people who do not belong to institutions or organizations, and they're just literally people. There's the farmers movement in India. There's the women's movement in Latin America. There's a women's movement in Pakistan as well. Um, and they really are the resistance. Yeah, right. So I think looking at these as a vector of change is extremely, extremely important. And we really need to delve deeper into that. Just very quickly, out of the 4 concepts within this consultation, diversification of funding sources came out on top. Everybody was unanimous about that. And second, the idea of looking at organizations as holistic entities as opposed to very fragmented and, categorized organizations or entities was also, it came out number 2. Countries as the core of change and regions as the drivers of change was, there was slight resistance towards both these concepts, and that's completely understandable because these are not concepts that we can talk about overnight. They're very, very complex. But I think the top 2 concepts were funding and looking at organizations, holistic entities. So I ended up calling for 3 actions just in the context of this consultation. This will not apply to the ecosystem as a whole, but social movement building as an essential driver of change, domestic partnerships for building collective actions, and diversifying of funding sources. I think within this context of civil society organizations in the Global South, I think these are the 3 actions that we need to focus on. So what's after this? Um, I asked people what did they think of the paper overall, those who had read it, and I got feedback saying it's very aspirational. Some said it's very radical. Some said it's not easy to implement. Some said that they could implement not all of it, but maybe a part of it here and there. And that was exactly the purpose of this paper. The purpose of this paper is that not everything in it has to be done. Um, uh, Even one of it can be done by one organization or one entity or one country or one group um, according to how they see themselves within the ecosystem. And you can delve deeper into that. The idea is not that this entire ecosystem has to be structured in its entirety. And it's not about whether you agree or disagree. I think a lot of things we immediately disagree on without actually trying them out or experimenting with them in real life. And I think that was one of the reasons that pushed me to write this paper, is that I think a lot of things weren't actually being tried out on the ground. In fact, nothing was being tried out on the ground. Very little was. And we need to do more and more on the ground to experiment, to actually come up and see what actually works when we talk about change. So this, as Jenny said, is just one in a much longer process that I had envisioned. It's the very first of a series of consultations with different groups, and it's not that even civil society in the Global South has been, completed that consultation. There are many, many different types of entities within the Global South and civil society. And so you can actually have these consultations with different sub-entities also in that. And I just hope that this is just the start of a longer process. It took a while in coming through, but I think now more than ever is the time where we actually need to experiment with something and see whether what can work, what can't work, what sort of change are we envisioning, what will it actually look like in terms of processes, in terms of money, in terms of implications. So I'm hoping that this is a sort of a springboard for many more consultations like this to happen for anyone who's interested in supporting such dialogues. I just want to end with some very personal reflections. And those are that, we've been talking about changes to foreign aid for decades now, not just years, but decades. I remember being in part of conversations when I used to work in the aid sector in Pakistan, desperately speaking to my northern counterparts across the table and saying, well, you know what? This needs to change, or this approach needs to change because it just does not apply to our context. And it fell on deaf ears, right? So I think a lot of us have been talking about alternatives to foreign aid and our own independence and autonomy for many, many years now. It's just that we were never really heard. The system was so strong and overpowering that there just wasn't enough space for those voices. Another thing I learned that I didn't set out to do these consultations or to develop this vision because I thought it was right or that I thought other people would think it would be wrong. This is basically a conversation starter. It was just one vision out of many. I know there are many other visions out there. Um, but I think you need more and more visions to actually bring about even a modicum of change, whether it's within a country or whether it's within a global system. So that was the purpose of this. There were no rights or wrongs. And that's why when I spoke to respondents, it was so refreshing to have a lot of honesty come out in the conversations. People who disagreed with some of what I had to say disagreed with it. And people who agreed with parts of it agreed with it. And they came up with fantastic justifications as to how. And for me, this is not about agreeing or disagreeing, right or wrong. This is about the absolute diversity of opinions that we have within our own communities that the global north narrative ignores, right? So the global north narrative is a very global north narrative about us. And here I am speaking to people at, the same level. There are community organizations. I've worked with community organizations. A lot of our countries have a lot of history in common. A lot of us have a lot of, social aspects in common. And so we were speaking with things that resonated. And I think that's really important for these conversations within the global south to happen on their own amongst each other, because this is where we will come up with some common ground, if not. It also, again, contextualization, like I said, there were so many things in common that I had with people who I spoke to in Indonesia, Pakistan and Indonesia, even though we're completely separate regions. And then we had so many differences even within our own region. When I spoke to people from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and India, we have a common history together, but a lot of our perceptions differed. So you can't just generalize about the global south being a monolith. A lot of our voices vary as much as they are similar. So for me, this was an incredible learning experience. I hope to continue learning if these consultations continue. And I want to thank each and every one of you who participated and gave their time and voices to this consultation. Without you, I don't think we'll ever be able to move forward. So thank you very, very much to Global Fund and Jenny and the team at Global Fund for giving me the opportunity to take this forward. And to all of you who participated in this. And I'm going to end there with a big thank you and open it up, the floor, and you can take it from there, Jenny. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Themrise. Well, if everyone's head isn't spinning with all that input.
Did I do half an hour or more than
sorry. I think just to reiterate this framing here, which is a provocation, an invitation, a sort of call for this radical imagining that needs to happen. And it's always easier to respond to something that somebody has drafted themselves in the first instance as well, right? So thank you, Themrise, for making yourself vulnerable by actually doing this process and laying out these questions. Obviously, it touches on so many things, on language and definition, on the importance of context versus universality. And we know that the notion of universal values is very much under attack at the moment. The relationship between ourselves as humans and questioning the issues of human rights. We're very much seeing that coming out of the logic of the Trump the Trump sort of ideology, but others, retreating into communities at a time rather than opening up. So really, my friends, this is a space for us all to do some reflecting and thinking together around in this current moment where perhaps, a few months ago, this might have felt like a sort of optional type of conversation, abstract, I haven't got time for this in the context of my day job. I think we do, as Themrise said, need more people coming into if not this system that is crumbling, what is the future? What are the future systems that the world needs right now? So I want to invite a couple of people who are actually a part of the consultation who are with us today to reflect on, you know, what struck them about the conversations with Themrise and the findings she's presenting, and how they're finding themselves thinking about this in the light of recent events. So Moses, I think you're still here. Can I turn to you, Moses Isoba from the NGO Forum in Uganda? What are you thinking? What would you like to say in response to what Themrise has shared here? Oh, we lost Moses.
Moses is here.
Moses was here, but then he disappeared.
His name is here, but he's gone shy.
Okay, well, we'll come back to Moses if we can find it, but I'm hoping.
There he is.
There you are.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you very much, Themrise, but inspiration as well, quotations and
Moses, do you want to switch your camera off?
I dropped out a little bit, eh?
Yeah, why don't you switch your camera off if it lags? Yeah.
Okay, maybe that'd be helpful. Yeah, so I said thank you. There are three things there that for me really made me really thinking, and I think one is thinking about resources beyond money, because oftentimes this whole conversation gets contaminated when the global north narrative kind of like puts money as everything. And I think it's important that we look as money as not being everything, because the communities that we work with, which actually could be a pivot for change, have some money. Never mind its small quantity of money, but there is money there as well. And so I think any meaningful development intervention needs to appreciate that as an important community asset, which we should actually be able to build on. And so there's this whole conversation of warm money versus cold money. The fact that communities have, and the money that is already given in the communities, albeit very small in volume, is money that is relational, money that is personal. It's not about filling in this timesheet, about filling in that different reports. So we have communities that are giving us warm money vis-a-vis the large volume of money that comes from the north, but it's cold money. So I think for me, the takeaway and listening to Themrise is the fact that it is important that every time we are considering development interventions, every time we are considering how we calibrate the relationship and how to be able to rebalance this conversation between the North and South, is that we need to kind of like have money out of the picture and then be able to talk. Because then there are other community assets that we can talk about. The communities have money, the communities have got skills, the communities have actually got some knowledge and expertise, and they've got relationships. And that is what is vitally important for us to really think of this alternative ecosystem, that we are putting attention to that. As when we're actually able to leverage these community assets, then we can actually be talking about triggering the citizen agency, the community voice and power. But the second thing that really also intrigues me is about when on one of the pillars when we talk about, can countries be the pivot for change? Can we have the countries as agents of change? And and I mean, I'm not even surprised that in terms of ranking, this comes like number 3. And the reason I think so, and in many of our countries, we have governments that have a legitimacy deficit. And we, as civil society organizations, and what actually really constrains civic space, is that we have states which fully kind of appreciate the role which we play, but we have governments that are oftentimes kind of like obscene sycophants of the regimes, and they're more interested in longevity. So you have a dichotomy here, of the state, which is responsive to our civil society work, the state, which is responsive and perhaps wants to looks at civil society actors as levers of change, and then you have the governments, that are often really filled with regime sycophants that don't want to do anything with civil society, and then we have also government that oftentimes have come into because of an election fraud. And when that happens, such a government lacks a legitimacy. And because of that legitimacy deficit, it cannot be really a pillar that you would like to look at for change. And I mean, and also the final thought from me is there is the trust deficit. We have a trust deficit between the civil society actors and the government. There is a trust deficit between us in the global south and those in the north, and that in itself complicates the whole aspect of looking at how we can do development. So I think, and I think it's Jenny who ends up with the point of understanding the context. So I think all these things, as we look at these different drivers, or looking at organizations as holistic entities, looking at the regional partnerships, countries as agents, and the diversification, I think it is important that we give these a contextual flavor, because it's going to vary from context to context. I think you may realize when you talk about diversification of funding, which we've been trying to do as much as possible in Africa, it may be slightly different from what is in Asia. This morning I was hearing, what it is in Indonesia, and may not necessarily be the same in Uganda. And so while we talk about the difference in governments, the difference in looking at regional partnerships and the diversification of funding, I think the aspect of context is also going to be important. So for me, Themrise, once again, thank you. But those for me are really things that I think are more food for thought, having to consider resources beyond money, the aspect of trust deficit, and then the governments also having legitimacy deficits. But this conversation would not have been, in any way at any better time like right now, when, all of a sudden, $42 billion of USAID funding supporting both humanitarianism and development has been sucked away. Couldn't we have anticipated this? Maybe yes, and we failed. I think as development practitioners, we've been A-rate, sort of front row at different pieces of work, but when it comes to being to drawing up scenarios, I think we got an F. And I think this is really a wake-up call for us. We should have predicted this and actually prepared that this was going to happen. Because we have always talked about the system is structural fraud, the system needs to change. But I think we never knew that there would be this doomsday when all of a sudden, a third of the development and humanitarianism financing would be stopped. So this conversation, I think, is critical, and it comes at a very, very important time for us to engage with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moses. Indeed, in conversations with many of our partners at the Global Fund for Community Foundations, where one of our big focuses is on the role of local resources and community philanthropy and their recognition as a kind of central dimension of an indication of trust and ownership, and how they are warmer in their flavor than external money. Partners have been saying a number of the points that you've raised, Moses, around we need to, some of the work has begun to start thinking about alternative resources to break this dependency with the only money is the money from outside, and to talk about less around the just a system built around transfer of funds and more one about the kind of building of power. And perhaps your comment around the distinction between the state and government. I think one or two people have said actually suddenly the state and civil society are forced to look at each other right now, because they're both, in the absence of funding that had provide buffers beforehand, they're kind of forced to say, well, in the absence of external money on both sides, what are some of the new negotiations that we need to have with each other to work together? So I think that, the longer term causes, as you've been talking about, Moses, as well as the immediate repercussions that might make some of those catalysts or cracks that will move this forward. I'm going to open it up to the floor in a second, but I want to hear from one more person, which is Ehsan, who's joining us from Bangladesh, who's with Nahab. I hope you're still here, Ehsan. You were also one of the people, there we go, that Themrise
Yes.
spoke to. It's great to see you. Over to you. Thank you. And then we'll open it up for discussion. So be ready with your comments and ideas after that. Over to you, Ehsan.
Thank you, Jenny. So it's a good evening, good morning for those who are from other side of the world. It's really pleasure to meet Themrise again in the virtually, and also thanks Jenny for arranging this dialogue. Good to see many other friends, including Wendy. We as a humanitarian development practitioner, we are always used to face the disasters. So even if this US blow came this time, I sorry, I need to turn off my video because I'm seeing the bandwidth is low. Uh, so we definitely we will be overcoming because we strongly believe in resilience. We are talking on the resilience, and the global community will face that. And so, uh, I have a strong conviction and confidence that okay, we will be, because globally we are facing many such disasters. Maybe this is one of which I agree with Moses that okay, maybe we should anticipate it, but we didn't. Uh, uh, my first reflection on Themari's presentation is really good to have this precisely presented. I also quickly browsed the publication that came out in 2023. I had some discussion with Themari during this Bogota summit. So this pleasure to hear her again. One of the strong point that I want to flag up with what is joining with Moses, as well as what Thimaraj mentioned about expanding the resource base beyond money. Exactly, that is one where the I came across with the GFCF when we are talking about this on this. The community really they have resources and they contribute, but they don't calculate it. So we are strongly in favor of bringing changes in the whole accounting system, and Jenny picked up it and arranged for us to join the Bogota summit and make sharing that. And in that Bogota summit, I found really quite a strong endorsement from across the globe. Whoever visited this poster exhibition, participated in that Bogota summit, yeah, community contribute quite substantially, but the accounting system doesn't allow that to reflect. So whole systemic changes is required. That is one, and I fully join with Themarize that okay, you wanted to expand the money, the resource base. It's not money only. It's not cash plus plus plus. There are many plus. So is the accounting system reform will really uh, help us to demonstrate that as well as to negotiate. And in Bangladesh, we are now piloting it. We are testing it. How the revised accounting system functions. So we would be able to share some time towards the end of this year the result that come out. My other two reflections, I'd be very brief. I'm not going to put detailing out there because many other people will be talking. Yeah, definitely, country is the focus. The what is your fund as a kind of hub for decision making as well as leading the process. But I want to add along with that is that country has its diversity as well. There are big countries, there are even smaller countries, there are diversity within the country. So that also need to be taken into account. And from NAHAB as a promoter of localization, we are seeing how really the diverse type of communities as well as the diversity in the disasters, humanitarian crisis, also demands different types of supporting and planning. So that need to be taken into consideration. So the sub-national level as well as the community level. Second one is about that one study currently I'm doing is found that okay, there is a big challenge of sharing data among the actors, even within national, international, in the name of data protection, in the name of data security. Not too much data sharing are being made at the ground level. That's why whatever the coordination issue are discussed at the national level or at the global level, at the ground level where the really the disaster effects or the crisis takes place, the harmonization doesn't work over there because people don't share data. That would be a big challenge area we need to keep in mind, and we need to find a way how really we can take out of that. uh, my last point is about you mentioned about this regional bondage. It's a geographical region is a one dimension only that came Themrise in your publication, in your research. I think that goes along with this what you said, the movement building. There are many cross-country movements, as you mentioned about this in the field of development as well as in the field of humanitarian services. The communication among the civil society groups, so it can be CSO to civil society groups across the globe, across the region, not necessarily limiting to this geographical dimension only. I stop here. Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me this floor. Jenny, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ehsan. And the work that Ehsan mentioned around trying to start looking at a counting system that could look at local resources differently I think is a part of a really interesting emergence, certainly amongst many of the organizations we work with, looking at the value of non-financial resources and assets as well as local financial ones, and trying to kind of work out what the value of those is in the context of a system which has tended to predominate to elevate one dominant resource. Lamnato, I see that you've just joined, and I don't want to jump onto you to ask you to see if you wanted to contribute, but you were also from Ghana, one of the people who contributed to the report. I don't know if you'd like to just share a word about the conversations that you had with Themrise, or whether you would just prefer to listen. But Lamnato, would you like to say something?
Oh my God.
I know,
Jenny,
sorry, I know.
I connected much earlier waiting. I had an emergency. I had to run out. I just came.
Okay.
In fact, I'm so
Well,
sorry.
You're
I'm hoping that the recording will be shared with me.
It will.
I'm very positive of the work Themrise have done. I mean, I'm looking at the processes towards having this piece of paper together, and the insight that it brought, in our conversations, and also my conversation with you, Jenny, about localization and also about shifting the power. It pains me that I've missed out, but I'm
No,
really,
don't worry.
I'm really looking forward to see the recordings. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, friends, colleagues, I can see some interesting chat happening in the chat space. So please, this is the time to jump in. Katia, I can see you've got your hand raised, so let's hear from you first. And if you'd just like to give your name and where you're joining us from, that would be great.
Thank you. I'm Katya, and yes, we are actually doing an initiative that looks into the different forms of assets and capitals that communities to generate, and how that leads to new funding models, and how we can leverage emerging technology like Web3, blockchain, DeFi, and ReFi to help explore different funding models. I wanted to definitely elevate the discussion about the alternative funding sources, but also what we can do as actually community to explore them. Because I think what we don't realize is that we have focused so much over the years on the traditional aid model that the other parallel have been really unexplored, also because we have not taken risks in the traditional aid system to actually invest there. And I'm saying because I'm coming myself from the philanthropic background, and we definitely did not take risks to invest and test out these models. So where do we find that kind of risk capital today, and how do we also engage with the private capital differently, you know, to try to experiment and explore. Because I definitely working now with the Web3 ecosystem, I can also see that this is a completely different, you know, more venture capital driven. We don't have philanthropic financing there. And on the other hand, the philanthropy and the traditional aid is only slowly exploring its potential. So if we want to explore new strategies, we also need to have the bridges that can connect the two worlds together. And so I'm also wondering if anyone has any ideas on how we navigate the bridge making.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katya. Yeah, this question about like the current system doesn't provide the kind of resources or surpluses to allow us to invest in these alternatives. Themrise, do you have any reflections you want to share on what you're hearing so far? And you can say, no, I'm going to carry on listening, or yeah, I've actually got a few things I'd like to say. Over to you.
No, I'd like to carry on listening a little bit. I think all the reflections are very valid. And like I've said, this is, everybody takes from this what they need to take from it. This is not something that is written in stone. And definitely there are a lot of issues that we really need to delve into deeper. So the state versus government definition as well, I think is important. Who is the state? Who is the government? Sometimes they're interchangeable. Who are they influenced by and who influences them, for instance? So I think those are very important issues, especially when you're talking about money. Where is the money going? Because I'm personally an advocate of money going, you know, government to government, because I think that will strengthen the national resolve. But of course, that's not as simple as it sounds. It's very complicated. It's very risky as well. But I don't think we shouldn't try to do to have that sort of a relationship. We have a bilateral relationship in place. We just haven't used it correctly. Both sides. So no, I'm happy to listen to more comments and reflections. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I mean, I can see we've got a couple of people who are involved in other kind of reimagining processes. I'm thinking of you, Wanjiru, with the global, I'm blanking.
GPI.
GPI, I was thinking, what's one of the stuff? But yes, if you'd like to talk about GPI, we've got Barry Knight here, who's working on some other kind of reimagining work. But I see in the chat, I see comments from Monica and from Sonia and Paula and lots of people kind of the question around the nation state. So anyone else want to jump in at this moment? Just use the hand raising function. Wanjiru, if you want to share about GPI. Oh, let's go to Monica first, as you raised your hand, and I can see that you've been active in the chat as well. So
thank you. Yeah,
introduce yourself.
We're very passionate about this idea. Sorry, I'm on the street here in New York, but for us, it's working with social movements and working with civil society and NGOs. Sometimes they are placed in different categories, and one thing that has always stood out, and I would love to hear from Themrise and others, and maybe this idea of social risk and political will of the NGOs or of those that are in country intermediaries, liaisons, whatever you want to call them. How do we balance that? How do we raise up social risk for civil society, social movements, at the same time lowering lifting up the political will of global entities with money, let's just say that, to see that risk, that they're taking a social risk for their autonomy and agency. And so I'm just curious about that. And yes, I did leave an invitation. We will be hosting with the second session of the Hive. It's very participatory and interactive. We work with Canva, and so everybody's invited. But that's my question about what are some thoughts about raising social risk, people willing to take a risk around this, because that means their own financial means and social capital, but also kind of scaring the people that you're getting the money from, right? So there you go. Thank you.
Right, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, because I kind of feel like your comment and Katya's comment before also we're sort of starting to build up a kind of an ask of the system, of those who still believe that we can invest in a new kind of system, of a different kind of resources. How do we understand things like risk and social risks that you mentioned? So I think the as we're kind of dealing with the present is like, what is the collective ask of investments into these kinds of new sorts of spaces too, because clearly there isn't a huge amount of resource. We've been just shuffling along the system we're in. Barry Knight, I can see you have your hand up. Would you like to join us? Barry works with us at the Global Fund for Community Foundation, but he also does many other things, one of which he's about to talk about, I hope.
Yes, I mean, I'd just like to welcome this, Themrise, you're kind of sticking your head above the parapet in this way. I think it's really helpful. I mean, I used to work with the Ford Foundation, and the senior vice president there wrote a paper once saying, the only time that you ever get listened to in terms of making suggestions is when there is a crisis. And I think we have a crisis now. So that in a sense, in putting these proposals forward, as you have done very boldly, I think we really need to kind of respond to them. And I think we need to kind of develop a dialogue around them. It's good that you've spoken to 18 or so folk, but I think what we really need in the sector is to get these ideas bubbling up, because for far too long we've been the passive recipients of a system that really hasn't worked well. And now we've got the opportunity, I know it's difficult, but actually to begin to craft something that actually is in the image of the sorts of societies that we want. And the kinds of ideas you're suggesting are radical. They bust the categories. They actually make us think in different kind of ways. And that's exactly the sort of thinking that is, I found really in rather short supply in recent years. Through a small sort of grant from the Hugh and Sandra Davidson Trust, we've been running a space in Alliance called Reforming International Development. And, we are, along with the Global Fund, really kind of sisters in kind of trying to shift the power. And I think one of the things that we've really managed over the 8 years is to begin to build a demand side in the kind of for the sort of impetus for reform. But what we've not been so successful at is actually influencing the supply side. So I think that really, one of the things that I think the movement for Shift the Power can now do is to begin to think about what kinds of systems would work for us with less money. And less money may actually be a benefit, at least in the medium to longer term, once we've got over the horrors of this particular moment. And in a way, we need to actually own our own power and our own values, because, as you pointed out, the shifting space this closing space argument is really partly driven by trying to shut people like us up. Now, so we really need to mobilize and not agonize, but to organize this space along the lines we want to do it. So I would encourage all the people on this call, to begin to sort of think about writing blogs for the Global Fund, or if you want to write one for Alliance, do be in touch with me, and we can begin to craft something that actually is much better than what we've had. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. We can agonize while we organize. Sometimes it's an essential part of the organizing, right? Anyone else want to chip in at this point? Other people have put things in the chat. Felipe, I said I can see you put a comment in. I don't know if you want to share it. Tina, you've just put something in the chat. Would you like to share it with the group? We don't have to just leave our limit of comments in the chat. Everyone busily digesting what they've heard so far. Wanjiri, would you like to say something about GPI? Because I think this is another, that if we have plates spinning around alternatives, this is a conversation that started at a different part of the system, right? As you and I were talking about the other day, kind of linking up the, is Wanjiri here before I start talking to myself? Yeah, no, I can see you're still here. How we kind of are thinking about the global system of finance and ODA, and then ideas like Themrise is like how we start to get these things sort of imbuing each other with their kind of energies and radical notions. But Wanjiri, would you like to say something about GPI? Oh, she's here, but not here also. Oh, that's too bad. Well, my friends, we still have 15 minutes, should we choose to use them. I mean, this is the kind of, when I first read your report, Themrise, I had to sort of walk my dog and digest the many dimensions of it. But maybe we could have some thinking about, so what do we do next? What in this moment, and what are some of the dots to be connected? Because clearly in the chat, it's clear that there are parallel processes, there are adjacent processes. How might we harness some of this radical reimagining? What's the repository? What are some of the ways of starting to weave between and bring more people into this conversation? Because at this moment, when there's a sort of deer caught in the headlights feeling for many of us in the system, actually we need to find these sort of safe, quieter spaces to think some of these things through. And Colleen, you just put a provocation in the chat around the real revolution we need is unlikely to be funded at scale. Like, do you want to say something about that? But really, like, just thinking about how can people like those gathered on this call today, what should we be doing more of? How can some of these ideas be taken forward? What are the platforms that we need to be thinking about, and the places where we can actually assert our own agency? Katya, you're going to come back in. You're welcome.
Thank you. That's actually a very exciting discussion every time I join some, Shift the Power movement, because it also gives the energy, I think, to carry on. So I agree with Barry's comments that we have done a lot of exposure and kind of fighting against something. And now it's time to actually build the alternative and the supply and do something. So I think it would be great if we could mobilize, if there are interesting streams of work that are already shaping up, even in this community on the call, how can we kind of pull the sources together into one basket and kind of organize separate discussions around that? Also, with different discussions happening about financing for development, for example, the meeting that is going to be in Sevilla in Spain, like how do we shape some of the discussions into those contexts? Because to me, it's about imagining alternative solutions, but also imagining also what the transition to those alternative solutions could look like, and advocating kind of what are the immediate steps that the different partners could take to enable that transition, and connecting the most unimaginable sort of, sources and actors together. So these are two things for me, is like, what are the spaces that are already shaping up that we could kind of take the discussions and elaborate on them and imagine possible solutions, and where do we see some strategic opportunities this year to inform or, to strategize, and yeah.
And I love that. So what are the spaces? And certainly we can think about this. We'll send everyone the recording and everything and an invitation to engage, and we'll chat with Themrise about what next, and with Barry and others who are involved in parallel spaces. But this idea also, how do we build bridges into some of the discourses that are happening that are often quite watertight in terms of the kind of conversation we've been having today? Is there a word here or a language there that could just be inserted in, which helps build a bridge into some of the conversations that need to happen? Brilliant. Anyone else? Otherwise, I'm going to, Themrise, I'm going to come back to you, but I just want to see if anyone else has any other thoughts. Barry suggesting we do a wiki.
Yes, I want to share something.
Yes, please, go ahead. Oh.
I have heard what is going on in this meeting. And my suggestion is that to strong philanthropy in all over the world, we should need a mission regarding youth energy. It is my suggestion to you today.
Great. Thank you so much. So like harnessing the energies of youth, right? So Ehsan, you've got your hand up, and then I'm going to pass back to you, Themrise. And I would like to invite everyone to take the shared responsibility of taking these ideas and digesting them further so that we can work out what we can all do. But Ehsan, did you still want to say something?
Yeah, just a small suggestion. Since GFCF is taking interest on many of those, and that Themrise identified couple of solutions as a in their publication, I think similar initiatives are across in different parts, and so it would be good idea to collate those solutions and around the common themes, so that there can be mutual sharing or learning mutually from across the world from different, because parallel similar events or initiatives are there. So GFCF can take initiative as a follow-up of this discussion and around some of the solutions that Themrise suggested, as well as what are coming up. And so this will build us to uh, strengthen the current initiative as well as learn from others. Thank you.
Thank you, and I can see there's great chat in the on the edges there. Barry suggesting, what about we do a review of Themrise's report to stimulate the conversation further? Evan is saying we've got to do more work on the supply side, and we know the supply side is also kind of looking at an empty page of ideas at the moment too. So how can we take some of this energy and these ideas and start feeding them back in with concrete demands and suggestions? Brilliant. Themrise, let me come back to you for some final thoughts on this this conversation you've heard so far in response to your generous sharing of your ideas. So why don't you close us off?
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you to everybody for your contributions. I think there are definitely several ways to do what we want to do. I would just reiterate a couple of things. And one is, who exactly are we speaking for? I know personally when I speak for the people of my country. So I speak for Pakistan primarily, and now Canada as well. So who are we speaking for when we talk about issues like alternate sources of funding? I think we're still in that part of the conversation where it's global meets local, where we're not actually focusing on the fact. I see many comments in the chat that says that are saying that, well, public funding is risky and dangerous. Philanthropy can also, be very dangerous. The private sector has its own agenda, so that's not an area. I think all these things are true. But I also think that it needs to be the country to decide. And it needs to be collectively the state, emboldened and influenced by its civil society to make the decision which avenue of funding works best for them. Now, that's not something we can do overnight. That will have risks. It'll have enormous risks. But just because something has risks doesn't mean that you don't try it out. And countries, I think, are not taking this risk because they are still far too dependent on the fact that money will come from somewhere from outside, whether or not it's ODA or whether or not that's a collective, financing for development, a global system that's being set up in another space. That is, I think, for the country to decide. And that's why my focus has always been for the country. Larger systems of how we put together different ideas in a more global system, I think it's too early to do that. I think that again will get absorbed by the larger global system leading the way, as opposed to letting countries lead the way or regions leading the way. So for me, I am a skeptic in the sense that I think the more national ways of revenue generation, be from the private sector, philanthropy, or ODA, or public sector funding, I think countries need to be accountable and responsible for the decisions that they make. And I don't think right now we're at that point where we need another global system driving our responses. Whether or not we feel they are more integrated with, recipient countries. We're still at that point where we're saying, how do we create new donors, whether they're private sector, whether they're emerging economies, as opposed to saying, how do we strengthen our own country systems ourselves? So I would just caution on the idea that, creating new global systems is still also as much of a risk as investing in local systems by national governments or looking at their own private sector. I think the risk is twofold, and it's both places. I think the main issue here is who decides. And I think the country needs to decide. And right now, the influence that countries are under because of their dependency on external forms of funding is also making them much more risk averse and making them still stick to more external forms of funding. Therefore, I would just urge all the discussions that are happening on a global level need to also take into account that they are, whether they like it or not, influencing a lot of national systems. And for me, I think the tables need to turn. So I will just leave it at that. Thank you so much. And I do hope these conversations continue. I do hope that a lot of local ideas come in from countries. For me, the biggest thing is discussing this idea with a country and a country's civil society as opposed to a number of people from different countries, because I think that's when we'll really get a better idea of where we stand as both independent countries, autonomous countries, who can contribute to a global system as opposed to the other way around. So thank you very much for that. And again, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I really do appreciate all the inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Themrise. Loud and clear. Let's just start from a different place, a different set of logics, and allow things to grow from there. So thank you, everyone, for joining. We will be thinking about how to kind of continue this conversation, you know, the opportunity to take multiple risks. I see many people on this call who are in their country context, innovating, experimenting, taking risks on their own. And these are drops in the ocean. Well, how can we start actually weaving something new and different out of all of this? So I want to recognize some of the really important work that many people on this call are doing too. So thank you, everyone, for joining. We will be in touch further. The work is clearly still to be done and the challenge is there, but we have to believe that many good people coming together with the right values and ideas can make a difference. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. That's all from us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.